We have with us today mostly AUB in-house experts, which is a pleasure. I will start by introducing John Nordson. He's an affiliated scholar at IFI right now and a postdoc fellow at the University of Oslo. He works within the field of environmental humanities. His current research explores how issues pertaining to climate change and the green shift are treated in public discourse in Lebanon and Kuwait. Mr. Jamal Saghir is an expert in infrastructure, energy, water, international finance, economic development, and policy with over 25 years of experience at the World Bank. Mr. Saghir is currently professor of practice at the Institute for the Study of International Development at McGill, affiliated scholar also here with us at IFI AUB, and senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Washington, D.C. Dr. Hassan Harajli is the manager of UNDP CEDRO project and UNDP Energy Advisor since 2009. He also lectures at AUB in energy economics and policy, among other things. He is a holder of a PhD from the University of Bath in Renewable Energy Economics and MS from Imperial College in Environmental Technology and double undergraduate degrees from AUB and the London School of Economics in Political Science and Environmental Policy. Dr. Ali Ahmad, he is the director of IFI's Energy Security Program, and since they're the host, I will not say more. And Dr. Nadim Farajallah, who is the director of the Climate Change and Environment Program, also here at IFI. On December 14, 2017, Lebanon's cabinet approved the offers of a consortium of international oil companies to explore for natural gas in maritime blocks 4 and 9, and this is expected to start in 2019. Such a move is thought to help the Lebanese economy overcome the present difficulties and to contribute to the country's economic development. And this is happening at a very challenging time where global energy markets are changing. There's significant advances in renewable energy technology, and there are increased pressures coming from climate change in terms of both the impacts and but also the country commitments to reduce emissions, such as those to the Paris Agreement. These factors, among other drivers, have led many countries around the world, even developing, to start their transition from oil and gas towards renewable energy, with targets up to 100% of national energy consumption shares. In light of this, and this is my first question to our discussants, if Lebanon is to think strategically of its national energy security in both the short and long run, what important elements or drivers need to be considered? I will start just from right, and you have a mic here, Ali.
Thank you, Rana. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. First, I think the term energy security deserves some attention from us. Historically, energy security meant different things at different times, and currently it means different things for different countries and different players. Perhaps for Lebanon, we have to worry first about having energy before we secure it. But just between brackets, and before I give my remarks on your question, I think energy security, by definition, in the traditional sense, is a myth. Like, even if a country has full access to energy resources, even if they have the technology developed or needed, even if they have the financing, you still have, like, one hacker can hack into your grid and can bring it down, like what happened in the Ukraine last year. So the whole definition of energy security, I think, the whole aim or effort put into energy security can still be undermined. Now, going back to Lebanon, I think it feels very liberating sitting on this chair and speaking as an academic as opposed to being in the government. So I have, to a certain extent, some sympathy for people in the government, but I think the main challenge when thinking about having energy strategy in Lebanon is this dynamics between short-term versus long-term. And sometimes these priorities can be contradictory, or at least there is some sort of trade-off between these two. So yeah, I have some sympathy for the government, because for Lebanon we have a substantial energy deficit. So it's very logical for any government to prioritize short-term solutions simply to cover this deficit, or attempting to cover this deficit. And also it's very politically beneficial if you showcase that you have done something that the country lacked for a long time. So it will be showcased as a political success. So this, however, this focus or emphasis on short-term solutions will come at a cost. Mostly short-term solutions are very expensive, so they have a substantial opportunity cost, and I believe this is something we can elaborate on as the discussion moves forward. Now, answering your question, I think also perhaps putting some material on the table for the discussion. When I think or look at energy policy in Lebanon, I think of, or the drivers or factors that impact energy policy planning in Lebanon, I think of what I call inflection points. So issues or factors that if they happen or could happen, they would influence our energy planning. The first one is the availability and commerciality of, I don't think commerciality is a word. Anyway, the commercial viability of oil and gas in Lebanon. This will certainly affect, if not the long term, the transitional term of our energy planning. The second inflection point is if our grid is modernized and the rate of modernizing our electricity grid, because the grid is seen as a limitation for having higher penetration of renewable energy. So as long as our grid is not updated, or as long as our grid is as it is right now, we are limited to how much energy we can incorporate in the grid. If you want to move forward and have more advanced grid, so we have to know when, if this would happen, and how long it will take to happen. Because this also will affect the dynamics between short-term and long-term solutions or strategies. And the last point I would like to say, the last inflection point is, in my opinion, is what happens in Syria. What happens in Syria pretty much can influence energy strategy in Lebanon, because when you are a policy planner in this country, would you think of Lebanon as an energy island, separated from the surrounding countries? And there are people in the policy world that promotes such an idea. Or do you think of Syria as a neighboring country that can give us cheap electricity, or can give us, we already have some connections with Syria, but are we going to take more electricity from Syria, or can we trade electricity from Syria in the future? So also the Syrian situation could be an inflection point of how energy policy in Lebanon will be shaped in the future.
Thank you, Ali. John, if you can also answer the same question.
Yes, thank you, Rana. So my approach to this issue focus on questions of social acceptability or popular support for different solutions. And the starting point then would be that energy transition in Lebanon or in any country is not only dependent on technical and economical possibilities and constraints, but also on the people involved. Of course, the people who make policy decisions, but also what you might call regular people, the people that employ new technology, that use electricity, that pay the bills or host a wind farm in their community. So what is social acceptance? It's really about whether or not people support or accept policies. And in this context, it's usually used to refer to two things: either people's views on environmental issues and policies in general, or perhaps more often, on their views on a particular policy or project, like a wind farm. And it's usually distinguished between whether or not people accept, support or accept an initiative, or if they refuse or actively resist. with the latter two being a problem for those responsible for the policy or the project, for a number of reasons. For one thing, if people do not accept the need for it, people might not be willing to pay for renewable technology, for instance. Or politicians might hardly support a project that faces a lot of public opposition because politicians want to get elected. And very often a problem is related to location of power plants or wind farms. That opposition to locating a wind farm in a particular community very often leads to problems with that project, often the project being delayed, which in turn has effects for the economic viability of the project. So it is an important factor. Now, what determines whether or not people support or accept a project? The literature seems to agree that, for one thing, people must agree that there is a problem to be solved, that the project that is presented actually solves that issue, that people are included. Thank you. That people are included in the process, also in decision making, that people see the transparency of the process, that people are giving clear information, that they trust the actors involved in the process, that they see clear and tangible benefits from the project, and that that project is perceived as fair, meaning that it's not seen, for instance, as something, for instance, a wind farm that might be difficult for a community to host, that it's placed in a remote community by a political elite in the capital, for instance, that it's not seen in that way. Now, that's one level of analysis, but of course, what constitutes fair or what is seen as sufficient benefits to support a project are not objectively given. These things are influenced by people's attitudes, by their values and beliefs, by how an issue is framed and presented to the public, and by the local context. Local context is seen as crucial, and this is a bit difficult, or unfortunately, there are very few studies looking into social acceptability in the Lebanese and Middle Eastern context so far. Most studies are focused in Europe or in America, so there's a need for more studies. Now, another point that I think is particularly relevant for our discussion today is that local context changes as energy transition or a green shift takes place. So, as the energy situation in Lebanon improves, and not least if a substantial oil and gas industry is developed in Lebanon, then people's expectation, people's habit, people's behavior will change. So it's one thing to say, for instance, that you're willing to pay for renewables in a situation of energy insecurity. It's quite a different thing to say that you're willing to pay for renewables in a situation of cheap and secure energy, although not renewable. And this also affects, for instance, whether or not people might be willing to accommodate a wind farm in their community. And as electricity supply goes up and as wealth connected to oil and gas goes up, so will consumption go up. And so might the interest in conserving energy go down, and economic incentives to conserve electricity might become less relevant. So, I mean, there's a lot of ifs here, but the point is that social acceptability is not only important for transition today, but technical and economical decisions made today will affect issues of social acceptability in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We'll come back to you with a question or more details about social acceptance. I will go now to Mr. Saghir.
Well, good morning. I'm very pleased to be with you today. Listen, I'm going to be a bit provocative. I just came back to this country after being away for 40 years. So I am between here, Washington, and Montreal. And when I look at the sector, the energy sector in Lebanon, it's definitely not in line with the economic development of the country. There is a mismatch, which is in my long experience in the World Bank for over 25 years. I've never seen it anywhere. So my first comment is Lebanon has, in the last several years, missed opportunities to move towards smart green energy. And it's still missing it, by the way. My second comment is when I benchmark Lebanon, I look at the good case studies around the world, and I look at the worst case studies, Lebanon fits squarely in the worst case studies. And we have to be honest about it at all levels. Technical choice, financial opportunities, energy mixed, energy security, and energy insecurity. And who's paying the price? The people. So when we talk about today the debate about oil versus renewable energy, in my opinion, both sectors are still missing in action. and will remain like that for a while. And Lebanon will remain addicted to oil import unless fundamental policy sector reform in the energy sector happen, unless you see incentive to move toward clean energy, and you have smart pricing to get renewable energy in place. So we can talk anything on the business side, but if there is no willingness for the government or the authorities to take policy decision, it's talk show. There are few attempts of doing some renewable energy. We've seen some PV here and there. There is a bid for 100 megawatt. Everybody is excited about it. All the companies are talking about it. This is very small. That's not what needs to be done. The danger I see here is the oversell of the gas story could jeopardize development of the renewable energy. And that's a very serious issue. We have to talk about it. An oversell. People make you believe that they're going to get the oil and gas and the liquid gas in the next 2 or 3 years. It's not going to happen. My experience as director of energy, oil and gas for the World Bank for over 15 years around the world will tell you it's not going to happen. It will take at least 10 years before you see commercial business in place. 10 years. In these 10 years, what do? We wait, we still import, we still get in corrupted sector, or we work toward clean renewable energy. So the discovery of the oil and gas in reality should be seen as an opportunity to push for renewable energy. And that's how I would like to see the government thinking about it. And the money that will be generated in the next 10 years, part of it should be earmarked toward developing renewable energy. That's what Sweden has done. That's what other countries in Africa are doing right now. Developing a sovereign fund only without having the other places in place will not make it happen either. The danger also of this oversell of the gas story is the Dutch disease. This country suddenly will get excited, a lot of inflow is coming, foreign currency, it will kill what we little have here. And they are not yet prepared for that. So I think from the macro side, it could have a negative impact. From the micro side, we might be waiting for something to happen, will not happen. So in my opinion, if really would like to move seriously, you have to move on the two fronts. You need to have a clear, really renewable energy policy, ambitious one. The objective of 12% is a joke. Let's be honest about it. 12% for this country, which has potential of 2 gigawatts of solar, it's a joke. They have to go at least for 25%. They can do it in the next 5 to 10 years, if there is political will, authorities are ready to do it, and if these elements are in place. Finance could be a problem, but Lebanon is also missing opportunity to pick up any of the green fund. They're not even know what it means. They're not getting any of the GF fund for renewable energy as it should be. And of course, they're not getting anything of the IFC fund except for the couple windmills that we're doing here and there. Thank you.
Okay.
I guess I'm the only non-energy person on this panel, and I'm approaching it totally from a different setting. I'm just want to look at it from an environmental perspective. And the way I see energy, as I see most other sectors that we are addressing in development, it cannot exist in and of itself in isolation. It has to be an integrated approach when we're looking at energy security in the short and the long run. And I believe in any development, the short run has to feed into the long run to make it feasible and make sense. It's common sense. So within that, what I want to look to just talk a little bit about is the role of energy in the water energy food nexus. To me, this is the core of what we have. We've been always doing this, and this is our mantra of the year or for the coming few years. Energy security alone may be good enough, but then if we don't couple that with availing water of good quality and quantity to people and making use of energy in making that available, it's a lost cause. Similarly, when we use energy, we use it, oftentimes it's referred to for cooling, that the demand is going to grow for energy in cooling. But similarly, energy is going to be needed to refrigerate. And food waste and food losses and the consequences associated with that are critical to make sure that energy is available to us in a sense that it is ensures for us a good supply of good quality food that is well maintained and stocked, and we don't have to turn over and lose a lot of that. Also, when we're looking at the short and long term, we need to look at where Lebanon is placed within the Paris Agreement and the now nationally determined, the NDC's nationally determined commitments that we have, what our commitments are. Jamal said that 12% is there. We still have other commitments that are more ambitious, and these are conditional based on available funding. I don't necessarily agree with what you said that Lebanon is not aware of the funding. We are well aware of those, but getting that funding and positioning ourselves to get that funding is sometimes problematic, not necessarily on an internal basis, but because of other issues. I'm sure a lot of people here in the audience can respond to that in a much better way than I can, but we are aware of this. We are trying to strive to get whatever is available to us. We have certain limitations that we cannot meet. So I just want to make sure that in saying the long-term strategic goal for us is to make sure we meet our commitments to the Paris Agreement first and foremost, and to the SDGs in terms of the different goals that affect directly the people.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this event. I would like to just say a few things that more or less have been said in one way or another by the speakers. Energy security is an evolving concept. It's not something static. It used to be mostly about availability of energy, the supply of power, a bit the economics. Now it's more the social, the environmental, including, of course, the availability of power and the accessibility. To define it, there's hundreds of ways to define it. But we can simplify it by saying that it is still about availability, having available resources of power. And maybe Lebanon, even though it's a decade away, could eventually be, and we expect it to be, a natural gas exporting nation. Could. In terms of accessibility, we never had any problems except during the war, as far as I know, to access the import of oil to Lebanon, maybe from Kuwait or Algeria. And unfortunately, we import 98% of our primary energy demand. So in terms of availability, accessibility, I don't see much issues. But the issues are really on the affordability and on the acceptability. The affordability, I just want to say a few things. Lebanon, from 2010 to 2016, we've been paying for fuel only, not the capital expenses, for buying fuel between $1.7 billion to $4.8 billion a year to buy fuel for electricity, for EDL, and for our neighborhood generators, and for heat requirements for the industrial sector. On average, this is around $3.3 billion, or 7% of our GDP. So this in and by itself is scary. And when it translates down to households, there's a study done a few years ago that said that Lebanese households pay, 50% of Lebanese households pay more than 10% of their income just to secure electricity. Now, I don't know about you, but 10% of income just to have the lights on, it's a lot. It's a burden. It should call for a Marshall Plan. But unfortunately, we've been going on as we've been going on for a long while now. Another thing is acceptability. Of course, John will talk about acceptability of technologies and what have you, but we have one of the most polluting power system that exists. We use one of the most polluting oils to generate power, and we use diesel generators as well. So what I would like to say is that we can't get it worse than this. So anything we do should be an improvement. We are a low-lying fruit in terms of the power sector. We can do so much. Now, reform is required to make the changes that are needed. And in the SADR conference, where a lot of money was pledged. It's all conditional on reform. Will the government actually do the reform? Will we do the regulatory authority in Lebanon? Or will we still say, oh, but we need to amend it since 2002 until today? A law in parliament is out that no one has implemented. Is that legal? Just a question. If a parliament enacts a law saying you have to establish a national regulatory authority to involve the private sector, is it legal not to implement the law? Is it okay? It's a question to ask. So all in all, I think that Lebanon's energy security situation is dire. It's very bad. But I am a bit optimistic, especially in the distributed sector. And there's some studies done by my colleague here in UNDP that in Lebanon 2009, when I came to the UNDP, and of course solar power was one of the most expensive ways to generate electricity. Now it's one of the most cheapest. We had less than 100 kilowatt of solar power on distributed level. Today, we expect up to the end of last year, and this will be confirmed in a few months, we should have around 40 megawatts of power distributed, of solar power. So there is hope on an individual basis, whether commercial sector, industrial sector, residential sector. There's still a long way to go, I believe, in the large-scale renewable energy sector.
Thank you, Hassan. This is a very interesting discussion. I'll go to Ali, and Jamal was saying, actually Hassan was saying that Lebanon could become an exporting gas country. Do you agree with that, with how markets are changing and the price of oil and gas is going down all around the world? So do you agree with what he's saying? Is there a potential?
Right. First, very quickly, I would like I was inspired by what Hassan mentioned in the very end regarding distributed energy. I mentioned inflection points locally, but there is actually a global inflection point. The cost of generation from renewable is going low. It's kind of getting closer to the cost of transmission. So can you imagine once this point is crossed, then the whole grid system will become questionable. Maybe I'm thinking too much into the future, but this is something we should definitely consider. Sorry for this. Now, going back to your question, I think the oil and gas, I am not an oil and gas expert, and I recognize there are faces in the audience who possess much more knowledge and experience than I am. But from an observer point of view, the oil and gas sector in Lebanon is very polarizing. And I think polarizing in terms of its importance, you have the people disagreeing with its importance, polarizing in terms of its commercial viability and marketability. People say that demand for natural gas will pick up in the future. Other people would say no. I think for me, this is a too early discussion, personally, because Jamal mentioned something very important about oil and gas projects, which is the lead time, the time it takes for these projects to materialize. And I don't know if it is 10 years, but certainly it's a long time, right? It is 10 years, okay. So 10 years, if you are looking at the evolution of the energy sector, 10 years, a lot can happen. Like a few years ago, people were celebrating that solar price reached energy parity or grid parity, which means that the cost of generation equal to the cost paid by the end user. Now we are way past that point. Now we have seen bids in places not far from here providing or proposing ridiculous cheap prices. So the energy sector is evolving so quickly and in a very dynamic way. When you think about it in 10 years, we will have a very different picture. And this comes my initial comment on the trade-off between short-term strategies and priorities and long-term priorities. So I'm sorry to disappoint you, Rana, but I don't think I have a clear answer to your question, but this is my observation.
Okay, thank you. So
no, listen, I think the issue here is that the baseline is so low, as we said, that you don't have this luxury to think only long term. You have a mess in your hand. So what do you do with it? You have to supply energy. The government is telling you, I'm going to bring you barges. That's the answer. And the 2 IPP that will be put here. That's the answer of the authorities. Barges mean more pollution. That's what we're talking about. What I am saying is you can leapfrog to renewable energy and you can get it quickly. If Senegal is able to get a deal right now for 3.5 cents per kilowatt, in Zambia for 4.5 per kilowatt, Lebanon can certainly get it with all the country risk, foreign country risk, for 6 cents per kilowatt. It is affordable, which comes back to affordability. It's feasible. It's a resource that exists, and it's not been harnessed. The problem I have, I don't think they believe in it. I don't think so. I don't think this country has done the shift toward green growth. I don't think the people of this country understand what does it mean going fully renewable. So the social acceptability, instead of putting pressure, is not helping us either. So I think there is a transition that needs to happen in the people's mind, because people are looking only at what they can consume right now. They have the generator, that's what there is a whole generation of people that have been grown on generator. So it's fantastic. That's why when you benchmark Lebanon to any African country, I can tell you, I work in 40 of them, this is among the lowest again. It's not the DRC, but it's close to, Ghana is much better, Mozambique is much better, Kenya is much better. At least they have an energy mix strategy. Here, the mix that we have is we don't have a lot of choices, actually. In 10 years, you're going to have the gas. You cannot have regional solution. When we talk about energy security, I love the concept, but don't believe in it anymore. It's all about energy and security, and you have to live with it. Energy security means who you are and where you are. That's my definition of it, by the way. And it's not only about oil and demand anymore. It's about all form of energy. So having a national energy strategy based on my own consumption will not be sufficient. However, if we are smart, we want to think about long term, then let's talk about power pool. What Norway has done, what Sweden has done, what the United States has done, then we talk another business. If you want to talk about power pool, now the Saudi Arabia will produce a lot of solar. If you can have a serious transmission line and you can work on it, but that's what I call my 15, 20 years dream. But right now, my dream is very simple. It's 1:01 Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Who's going to give me electricity? And it's going to be clean energy. Nobody.
Okay. Maybe Hassan, you can comment on the issue of leapfrogging to renewable energy while we're thinking of gas in 10 years?
Yes, sure, of course. First of all, in the course of several years, we at the UNDP did a set of assessments on resources in Lebanon. And we found that Lebanon, for a small country, we have almost more than 5 gigawatts of potential of wind. We have more than 100 gigawatts, if you want, of solar PV. And this is away from urban areas, away from natural reserves, away from inclined places that you can't do economically feasible renewable energy system. We have hydropower, 900 megawatts of potential, although there's an issue now of water and snowfall and all that. And we have an immense potential in distributed generation. So the potential is there for a small country. But as Dr. Ali said, we have a problem of the transmission line and distribution line and the grid and the operation of the grid. Until you solve these, we cannot leapfrog. You have to solve these. Now the ministry is being a bit ambitious, in my opinion, in releasing these renewable energy bids or expression of interest. So they have 200 megawatts. A PPA is signed. It's not over yet, not fully bankable, but they're working towards it. 200 megawatt of wind. They have 180 megawatt of solar all over Lebanon. It's still in the evaluation process. They now released 200 to 400 megawatt of wind again, an expression of interest, and they have another 300 megawatts of solar, and they want those with utility storage. And they have hydro plants. But I still feel that they're working alone. Like you said, there's like a schizophrenia in their approach. It's like they're working like an island on this thing. Well, the problems and the grid and all that have to integrate these renewables is not really being taken into account. And I think that this is a big problem that we're going to face in the future, because all the PPAs have a take or pay clause with the government. If the government doesn't take your power, cannot take your power for some reason, the government has to pay. So this is a big issue at the moment. Can we leapfrog? I think we are leapfrogging at the distributed level. That's where we can leapfrog. Okay. Now, energy efficiency, just the last word, and renewable energy, between 3 cents on distributed level to 11 cents maximum, depending what you're doing. You can do energy efficiency measures, renewable energy at your home, in your office. We're paying between 14 and 18 cents with the current oil prices. It's a no-brainer, economically speaking, and this should be the driver that will make us leapfrog if we continue on these soft loan programs that will take away the barrier of upfront capital required.
Okay, thank you. John, there was a mention of Norway, the case of Norway, and if you'd like to comment a bit about that, to learn a bit, since you're with us, about that.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think there are different things that might be relevant in terms of the Norwegian experience, but one thing perhaps is the issue of transitioning when you have a well-functioning system in place, or when you have something in place that has created a lot of jobs and expectations and habits, as we have in Norway. I mean, the oil and gas industry in Norway has provided a lot for Norwegian society, the largest sovereign wealth fund. Today, about 300,000 people in Norway are employed directly or indirectly in the oil sector, which is a lot. I mean, Norway's population is about the same as Lebanon's. So that's good. But there are a lot of problems as well concerning the oil industry in Norway. One thing is in terms of climate change, in terms of emissions. Norway's emissions have not, I mean, we were supposed to go below 1990 levels, but we have actually increased compared to 1990 levels. Whereas Sweden, for instance, have decreased a lot compared to 1990 levels. And in 2016, Norway's emissions in absolute numbers were more than Sweden. And Sweden has twice the population of Norway. And the oil and gas industry in Norwegian waters, about 27 or 28% of Norwegian emissions stem from the oil and gas industry. So even though there are a lot of policies in place and so on to make it as clean as it can be, it's still a big environmental problem. But it's also a social and economical problem, because the Norwegian economy is naturally very tied to the oil and gas industry. And in 2014, when the oil prices dropped, it created a local economic crisis in the western part of Norway, where the oil and gas industry is situated, and with rapidly increasing unemployment. Now, things are better now, and the oil and gas industry have cut costs a lot. But in the future, it's quite insecure. I mean, even though it's efficient, the Norwegian oil and gas industry, it's still more expensive to produce oil in Norwegian waters than in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. And if oil prices keep, I mean, now they're rising, but if they will plunge in the future, it might lead to similar problems again. So what Norway should do is start transitioning, start preparing for a future in which we have to rely less on oil energy. But that is extremely difficult. I mean, there are some political parties in Norway advocating sort of starting the transition, not opening new fields and so on. Usually talking about the environmental focus. But for those people who actually work in this industry, for the 300,000 people that depend on this industry, I mean, they do not want to leave this industry. This is the livelihood that's depending on it. So what you get is sort of two different discourses. You get the environmental discourse, much of it based in Oslo, and then you get the localized or a different perception in the areas that are where people actually work in the oil and gas industry. And then you get the whole center-periphery thing as well, with those people seeing that they're being attacked from politicians in Oslo and so on. Now, the point isn't that this is impossible, but it's with all the expectations, all the behavior, all the people dependent on this industry, it's really difficult to transition. So, I mean, as many have said, we do not know where Lebanon is going, and it might take 10 years before there's a viable industry, but investments are being made today, plans are being made today, and when you make investments, you hope to gain from them as well. So if you start going down that path, then, I mean, there are many things that make you want to continue down that path, and doing so might make a transition in the future more difficult. I mean, at least it has a profound effect on a transition in the future.
Okay. I'll go to Nadim before I'll let the audience join this discussion. So John was talking about the environmental discourse in Norway and how that has played a role in the energy discussion. So what can you say about that becoming, if ever, a discussion in Lebanon, the environmental driver or climate change emissions driver?
it's tough to answer that. The vision most people see is they relate pollution to generators and to cars. And only those that live next to power plants complain about emissions from those. And whether renewables are cleaner or not does not factor as high as whether they can get cheaper electricity or not. So that vision is what's driving the cost more than the cleanliness and the environmental consideration. And for that should be sort of overcome. We did a study here a few years ago. You remember that? We supported a study here on the emissions from generators. And 38% of exposure to carcinogens in Ras Beirut comes from generators. 38% generators that only operate 3 hours a day. And this is a whole lot. And the level of susceptibility or potential to get cancer is substantially higher for those that live next to generators. And that is not really, has not sunk in to people. The association is not really solid there. And this is something that has to be done at the social level, community level, and also be bought in by the government. The government did put out, the Ministry of Environment did put out the cost of climate change. And there is a huge, in the billions of dollars, cost to health and illnesses due to climate change. And a significant portion of that, I would hazard to say, and I think Leia and Vahak would detail it more, is due to direct inhalation of particulates and carcinogens from emissions. So there is that component that really people need to understand, that not only the Ministry of Environment has to tackle, but this has to be a public health issue that should be dealt with on overall.
Okay, great. Now, if anyone has a comment or a question, but please keep it very short so that we are able to take many questions. I'll start, please, here in the beginning.
Yeah. I'm Qasim Ghraib. I'm expert in oil and gas field development and professor at the Chemical and Petroleum Engineering Department here at AUB. Just first, one comment on the title. There is gas between oil and renewables. This is a very important part. I think when we speak about renewables versus hydrocarbon energy, there is the cost and there is the environmental aspects. Since we have put aside the risk or the energy supply risks in the future. From a global perspective, I mean, if we look at the BP forecasts for the coming 25 years, we can see that there is, despite the efficiency in the utilization of energy, we've got 30% increase in terms of demand of energy in the coming 25 years. Obviously, around 40% of that increase is going to come from renewables. So 40% of the increase rather than 40% of our entire bill. However, by far, gas will contribute to most of this increase, by far. I mean, this is because of the cost, because of the environmental footprint, because it's much cleaner than oil, the liquid oil. The liquid oil demand will plateau around, I mean, will keep increasing, but will plateau by end of 2040, 2045. So gas is very important in terms of cost and in terms of environmental footprint. Now, I would like to compare myself with the United States and Norway and other countries. It's not like because I don't want to compare myself with them. They have gone through 100 years nearly of using of hydrocarbon, and then they are transitioning into using renewables. Of course. My point is, in country, we need to take into consideration the context. In 2 years' time, very likely, we would know whether we've got gas or not. So if we are lucky, there will be commercial discoveries in 2 years' time. And we don't have to discover 50 trillion cubic feet of gas to be happy in Lebanon. It is enough if we've got 3 trillion cubic feet of gas, the size of the Karish field in occupied Palestine, to be enough for Lebanon in terms of energy needs. If we switch everything to gas, not only like current energy needs, if we switch everything to gas, that will satisfy us for 20 to 30 years. Only a field of the size of Karish, which is a fraction of the field of Tamar and Leviathan. So we can wait 2 years, but the likelihood of discovering commercial gas is very high in Lebanon. Now, what can we do? I mean, 10 years is a bit exaggerated. Of course, in Lebanon, it might take 100 years. But I'm talking about the technical limit. So the bureaucracy limit is out of our hands. So if we are going to take a look on the problem from a technical point of view, 10 years is a bit exaggerated. If I take a look on Egypt and the Zohar field story from discovery to first gas, it took 3-4 years. Of course, they have experience, actually 3 years. They have experience which we don't have, but 10 years still is a bit exaggerated. What we can do, so let's say it's 10 years. So what should we do until then? Should we invest in capital investment in expenditure in renewables, or should we start building our infrastructure for gas? So there is two decisions that can be taken. We have zero infrastructure for gas. We can start investing in infrastructure for gas, onshore infrastructure. That's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money. In the meanwhile, if the likelihood of discovering gas is very high, in the meanwhile, we can build trains, LNG trains in Lebanon, and we can start importing gas in the meanwhile, so that we start feeding our grid with gas, with imported gas, until our national gas starts streaming. So there is a decision to be taken. Should we start investing? And that's capital expenditure for renewable is not dollars. It's going to be billions to come up to 50, 25% or more. That we might not need less money to build an infrastructure of gas home. Imagine Lebanon running on gas in 10 years. Just imagine, we will get rid of all of these generators. We will have much cleaner environment, much cleaner by no means not comparable with the environment now. We will have a cheap energy, and it's in between the oil that we are using now in terms of, and the renewables. And by that time, renewables will become much cheaper. Instead of me trying to develop renewable now, let me use the cheap energy, that the same that Norway has done and the same that the United States has done and all of these countries have done. Let me use my cheap energy now, and by the time the renewable becomes commodity and much cheaper, then I'll develop I'll do a mix. Let me start first crawling before flying. Let's crawl with gas first. It's much cleaner, much cheaper, and in our context, it's coming, very likely coming.
Let me comment.
You want to comment right away? Okay.
I hear you. I like to agree to disagree. I hear you. I think this is good. Let's take the case of Norway. Norway is an oil exporting country. Norway, when they developed the hydropower, it's a cheap source. It's around 5 cents per kilowatt. It was cheaper than any solar at that time. I was involved in some of that project. When you look at the United States, when they developed the hydropower, at that time, there was limited sources. So you don't want to benchmark yourself to the G7, that's good, but not sufficient. The reality is, the financing mechanism that you're talking about for infrastructure financing for your gas, that might come, might not come in 2 years, is nobody will finance it. Nobody will finance it. Let's be honest about it. I'm a banker all my life. I will not finance you on something that might come and put a hope and give me source of energy for what? 25 years. You are telling me you're going to give generation for you're going to give gas for 2 generations. After 25 years, what do? I go back to basics.
This is not what I've said. I've said that if only we get the size of Karish, and we have a probability, very likely probable.
But you have a source of energy that you can get right now for 3.5 cents per kilowatt solar with 1 gigawatt in the Bekaa area. Why don't you capture it? Answer that question, not the other question. Why don't you capture your cheap source of energy available next door? 3.5 cents per kilowatt, for God's sake.
Do you,
It's cheaper than your
do you have
gas.
an idea how gas we are gonna? What is the likelihood of the P50, even the P10 of the gas that we are gonna get?
Yeah.
Our P10, like,
Export it, get a hard currency for your macroeconomics.
and people who are importing it, what are they doing with it? Tell me, just burning it? They are generating electricity with it.
Your gas, use it as a source of revenue. This country does not produce industry, so use it as a source of earning hard currency. Export it. But you cannot build your industry on the border.
Jamal, we're going to come back to you and we're going to discuss a bit more the investment landscape of both gas and renewables with everyone. Let's just take some more questions from the audience or comments.
Could I say something? Or?
Yeah, let's start. Richard has
Yeah, okay,
the mic
hi.
first, and then we'll go.
Sorry,
But really,
whoever's
please,
hand
if
is
we
up
can
there,
be,
sorry, we'll get to you.
Richard, if we really can be very brief, straight to the point, please.
Point taken. Yeah, hi, Richard Banfield from International College. I work in sustainability and communications. I'd like to start with a general comment, and I will make it very brief, I promise. Your introduction, Rana, from maybe this is a slightly naive comment, but it was very interesting how you introduced the panel today, and your two main points were the December 2017 licenses about the search for more gas. Is that right? If I was from the government,
Yeah.
The granting of more.
When they approved the contracts for
Right, approval of the contracts. Yeah. Yet on the other side, the long-term targets for 100% renewable energy. And so I don't know if I talk to a 13-year-old at IC and I say the government have just approved the contracts to these, gas, the pipeline. But they've also said they are also planning on these 100% targets for renewable energy.
Not Lebanon. I was saying other countries.
Oh, other countries.
Yeah,
okay.
Of course not. We're at 12% by 2020.
Yeah, no, I'm quite aware of Lebanon and the 12% target and of the countries that have 100% renewable energy already. Yeah. Like Costa Rica and Iceland, for example. Okay, so maybe I misunderstood. I'm very sorry. So the question, it's more about public opinion and changing the mindset of the Lebanese population when it comes to renewable energy. And it's kind of focused on you, Jamal, and maybe John as well. How do we do that? You know, at IC, we've just signed a contract to invest in solar panels. I'm certainly very passionate. We are all very passionate about the educational transformation that the kids, they live and breathe, and they see solar panels working and functioning, and then they will probably go home to their parents and talk about, these wonderful things that we have at school, and maybe that will make a shift in the population's mindset. But I wanted to kind of ask about maybe communications like talking about climate change, actually, Nadine, and how that can be communicated better, and also the role of business within all of this, and how business can, take up the mantle for renewable energy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Was that short enough? Short enough.
Thanks.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you.
Stand up. Thank you. Diana Al-Qaisi, Lebanese Oil and Gas Initiative. Can you hear me without that? I don't think this
No, please, but we need you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting. Very brief also. I just have to disagree with the gentleman regarding the timing. We really need to manage our expectations when it comes to oil and gas. We don't want to fall or to end up doing or to fall into what other countries such as Ghana, somebody cited Ghana, what they encountered as the pre-source curse. We over-expected. They went into so many economic development plans, and they never met it, and now they're really suffering because of that. But to park that there, I think that we need to take two things into consideration when we're talking about renewable energy. I don't think Lebanon lacks any studies or any sound advice. A lot of international bodies have made a lot of studies and presented them. I think what we lack are two things. First of all, we need to acknowledge the fact that we have a poor process when it comes to decision making. And this is what is stopping a lot of things. So when it comes to deciding whether the route to take when it comes to renewable energy, the lack of having proper decision-making routes is really standing in the way. The other thing that we really need to take into consideration is corruption. And it's the elephant in the room. We all know what needs to be done. But there is an element of corruption that stands in the way of us taking the right route, whether it comes for Lebanon. I wonder how we plan to tackle this. What would be the intention of the World Bank, if we're going to cite the World Bank or the UNDP or any other international body? I know that Norway struggled at one point, especially in the 80s. You did it the hard way. How did you handle that? How did you handle the process of decision making? How did you handle putting aside all the corruptive acts that stood in the way of progress when it comes to renewable energy? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one more. We'll come back. So we have one there, please. Yeah, we'll take the answers and then come back for you, sir.
I'll try to be quick. Julien Chaissati, Greenpeace. As an organization, globally, we're pushing for 100% renewable energy. And we think there's no financial, no technical obstacle for that. So some people might call us crazy or hippies, but what I've heard today is quite music to my ear on this panel. Because what Dr. Jamal, we need to talk. And also, we in Lebanon, we really push for distributed solar energy, not only because technically it's feasible, but because we are avoiding a snake pit, which is centralized in Lebanon, and we believe we don't want to go in there, although it's also linked to infrastructure. My question is, and I think it's along the line of the previous questions, is how do we get out of this golden cage we're all in? Because we're kind of preaching the choir here, and although we disagree with gas, for example, we believe even from environmental footprint is much higher than we believe. There's a lot of leakage of gas in field that we need to take into account. How do we take this debate, this discourse, out of this golden cage into the right people's ear? How do we get Dr. Jamal in the Ministry of Energy talking to the Minister of Energy and being the advisor of the Minister of Energy instead of somebody else? Because this is what really matters. Because in the end, here the policy are all about influence and whose word is reaching whose ear. So how do we do it?
Okay. Thank you. So maybe we can start with you, John, about the question regarding how do we change the mindset and communications.
Yeah, don't have a definitive answer, unfortunately. Yeah. No, but I think several things, and I think there's lots of great work being done in Lebanon, not demonstration projects that actually show people in local communities how you can employ different kinds of technologies and so on. So you take away a level, you don't have to trust an authority you don't see, you don't have to just take anyone's word for anything, you can actually see how it works and you can see that this actually creates benefits, which I think is a great thing. And then in terms of communication and in terms of framing of the issues, it's central. I mean, one thing is how you actually articulate the problem that you're facing. Because if you say that we need more electricity, or if you say that we need to be more conscious about how we use electricity, or if you say we need more green electricity, I mean, you get three different answers and for three different ways of framing the question. So if the question only is how do you get more energy quickly, then that's perhaps not the most ideal way to frame the issue, at least not in the long term in terms of a transition in the future. And then there's the kind of different initiatives or the kind of things, the kind of values that you refer to when you ask people to behave in a certain way or to pay for something or to support something. There is some quite interesting research being done that I found that you get very different results if you frame something in economic terms or if you frame it in environmental terms. For instance, if you ask people to conserve energy for economic reasons, then it's just, you do the math, and if you save money, fine. If you don't save money, then you don't do anything. You continue to spend energy as you did. And it's also a question of, is it worth it? Do I save enough to do something? And the research found that there were very few positive spillover effects into other kinds of behavior. I mean, if you save electricity for economic reasons, you don't necessarily start saving water, because that's a different question. But if you frame it in environmental terms, then you found a lot of positive spillover effects. I mean, you start saving energy, and then you're thinking, maybe I should start saving water as well. And also, you find that the question of is it worth it or not, that's not relevant anymore. On the other hand, there are problems there as well, that people, we have the issue of, is it really helping? Am I, as an individual, able to do something that actually matters in these questions and so on? So it's not an easy fix, but how you frame it is crucial. And if I could just a couple of short more comments. What was mentioned there about managing expectations, I think it's extremely crucial, as many have mentioned, that either way, whatever way Lebanon goes, managing those expectations is so crucial for any future transitions. And concerning Norway in the 80s, unfortunately, I do not know enough about the process in Norway in the 80s to answer that. Institutional strength is obviously one point, and then social engagement has had a lot to say for how Norwegian oil industry has developed, especially in the 80s and 90s. But then there's been problems. Norwegian oil companies have been found guilty of corruption and so on as well, but then you have strong institutions that actually are able to punish those that did it. Yeah.
Thank you. Ali, maybe you can comment. Someone disagreed with you, so.
Yes, actually, if I may, I would like to comment quickly on 3 points. First of all, I think there is some truth. I partially agree with Qasim. Let's say, personally, I would love Lebanon to be 100% renewable as soon as possible. But the reality is not that. The reality is you can put this as a long term, but meanwhile you need energy. And natural gas is the transitional fuel, whether we like it or not. And this is the reality. Now, meanwhile, you can work on, we talk supply, but meanwhile you can work on the demand side and try to, someone mentioned in the panel that this is the low-hanging fruit, and I agree with that. But natural gas will be needed for Lebanon, and Qasim is right. The word natural gas is the preferred transitional fuel globally. This is the reality. Regarding the point on corruption, this is like, I'm half joking, half serious. So I hear a lot about people or the political establishment love for oil and gas because of some benefits that they get out of it. Personally, I'm very careful to say these things, not because I don't believe or believe, is like I don't like to say anything that's not supported by evidence, or I don't like to just repeat a public rhetoric. But maybe in a funny way, maybe we should develop a guide for green corruption, which like to develop a guide for how to be corrupt and yet develop promote renewable energy. Maybe instead of taking commissions from oil and gas, you take commissions, I don't know, from solar panel. somebody today will be like Googling Chinese solar panel companies, maybe. I think the gentleman from Greenpeace asked a wonderful question, is where do we go from here? And I would love to hear answers to this question from the panel, but also from the audience, and we have people who are advisors to
Ali,
ministers in the panel as well.
You're jumping ahead. We're going to have that as our last question.
Okay, sorry.
So we'll close with that.
In that case, I will stop here.
Yeah, okay, great. I just want to have Hassan's opinion regarding renewable energy, and if what's really holding it back is just the proper decision making. So is it true that we have enough studies, we know where to go, everything is ready, it's just the decision making that's holding it back?
A big part of it, yes. I mean, the 200 megawatt wind farm that has been signed has been 6 years or 7 years in the bidding process. And that's because we don't have the institution that should be set up to do these bidding requirements. And this is a big issue. Now, I would like just to say one point about the 100% renewables. Of course, I mean, corruption and what have you is a problem. And in natural gas, just a small point, LNG, we have power plants in Lebanon designed on gas, but gas never came. And liquefied natural gas, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not from the oil and gas sector, has been talked about for years and years now in Lebanon. It was feasible for years and years now in Lebanon, but it has stalled and stalled and stalled. Because centralized power, centralized energy is also centralized power and centralized money. And that's where the politics come in. I really believe renewables can break that. So there is corruption in renewables, yes, on a big scale, but I believe each and every one of us who installs a PV panel is taking away power from a group of few, and that's the important part. And the missing link, the last missing link to reach the 100% renewables is storage. But look at the storage. The same thing with storage has happened with solar PV panels. Maybe not as fast, but something is changing very quickly. When utility storage crosses that line, why do you need conventional power? Now, this is a big question that we have to answer. I know for a fact that Lebanon is starting to think about this, at least in some circles. They're thinking, why do we need to reinforce the transmission grid when we can put utility storage at the user's side, and then we can shave peak demand and not require grid reinforcement, because we can stock up storage during the middle of the night and give power at the peak times. This is happening, and rather quickly. And this is a change from now to 10 years, but I think that it is going to change, just like PV. In a matter of 7 years, it completely transformed. And storage, utility storage, is heading there as well. And so someday when the oil and then the gas is out, we're going to maybe ask ourselves a question, okay, the gas is out, but oh my God, look what I have here. So we're digging our heads down. We're going deep, but something is happening on the ground. This is...
Thank you, Hassan. Nadim, would you like to say something? Maybe on what would it take to convince the government?
A couple of things also. Communicating, as Richard said, was talking about how do we communicate. Well, part and parcel of what we do as a program here is to communicate issues to the general public, and we reach out to as many different sectors of society. We talk to IC students frequently, we talk to universities, and reach out to NGOs, and we are very much aligned with a lot of what the Ministry of Environment's climate change program does, and we support greatly what they're doing in terms of communicating that. However, one thing that we find is most important to communicate or to convince people is to put a dollar value. It doesn't matter, when you talk about health, yes, I go live in the mountains, or I put something on my mouth and whatever, not to breathe in the air. But the minute you put a dollar value to some aspect, and we've already done that when looking at climate change in general, in terms of the impact on climate change on agriculture and its higher order impact on the Lebanese economy. The ministry has done that on general economic development in Lebanon, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of cost that they came up with by 2050 if we do the things that we're still doing. So there are now dollar values assigned. Now if we can then break it down to little bits and pieces as to how much would it cost if we stick to this form of energy versus that, then that becomes more convincing. So this is something we need to get into. However, there are two issues that are missing so far in our discussion. One is, and it has been alluded to twice or talked about in passing twice, is hydropower. Hydropower is building dams, fine. And I'm not against dams, I'm not necessarily for dams. However, dams for hydropower require a certain storage capacity to ensure continuous supply. This, with the changing climate that we have, with the changing precipitation that we get, form of precipitation that we get, might not be possible. Our storage capacity might be needed just enough for us to use that water and consume it, rather than put it through a hydropower system. So this is something, in my mind, is that let's put it aside. It's too costly, too controversial for little return on what we need to put in. There are other better, more hard-hitting renewables that we can get to quickly. And the other thing that we're missing, that we have not talked about, is emissions from transport systems. And when I talked about, we need to integrate the energy sector development, it is not in isolation of the transport sector development. A lot of the pollutants, most of the pollution comes from electricity generation, true, but the next largest one is transport. And this has several limitations that we have. There is first no transportation plan for Lebanon as a whole. And the best that we get is more roads, and more roads lead to more pollution, more congestion. There is no limitation on vehicular transport. There is then also no infrastructure. If we need to get into electric vehicles, there is no infrastructure in place yet to power up these vehicles, to gas stations or power stations. They're not there yet for us to use. And then there is a limitation on the number of electric vehicles that are imported, and then the taxes to it. Recently, the taxes have been nearly abolished on EVs, so it's very limited now. That's great, but still then we need to go to behavioral change and convince people that you really don't need to have this 400 brake horsepower car. You only need is a 40 brake horsepower car to get you around Beirut. You don't need this power, this huge SUV, and this to get away from the show-offness that we have. So then that comes in next. So these are what I want to get in as a point.
Back to
Let me come back on the issue that Hassan, I think you are right. I think there are two ways to look at the issues. First, if you want to scale up renewable energy, there is one study missing, by the way. We don't know the capacity of the transmission network. What I know is they can absorb around 20%. More than this, it's not known. You will need more investment. And actually, we're checking with the World Bank, we're checking with the IFD, we're checking with few people. This needs to be understood. EDF is doing some work. Nobody, even the EDL, doesn't know how much you can throw in the system. On the other hand, if you go on the distributed generation and you put serious storage, I think that could be done. And I think if you go at the municipality level, which have lands, you can also think of a scheme where municipality could be provider of utility in addition to individual, because you need something. Are they ready to have that discussion? So far the argument against renewable was there are no lands. There are not available land. We looked at it, we looked at the solar, we looked with the center, there are a lot of lands actually available. The monastery have a lot of land, municipality have land, in the Bekaa you have plenty north, south, east. We have now a good mapping, 3-dimension. So that's not the issue. Then the issue was transmission. So I think your solution, if you want to call the bluff, we can go. I can go with this. But you have to bring the storage seriously. The bid that is being put now for 12th of July is around 200 megawatt with 100 megawatt with 70.
300 megawatts, each one 70 to 100 megawatts.
Each of them.
Each one 70 megawatt hours.
Okay.
Which is crazy.
But, thank you very much. I didn't say it, he said it. It's nonsense.
Crazy ambitious.
I'm sorry. No. It's nonsense. I am the board of one of the largest energy storage company, Bolloré. It's nonsense. They looked at it. It doesn't make sense. So again, we have studies, but we have ambition beyond our means. And that's why I don't like it. If you want to do 100 megawatt, get me 20 storage, and I think I will be available with that. So I think it's time to start looking at the dashboard in a much more honest way.
I just want to add something very quickly. It's not maybe storage is modular, and you can do more and more storage. You can be ambitious, maybe. But my question is, did they study the power system as a whole, demand, supply, when we need demand, when not, and different power systems, when they come online, when they don't? Do we need storage? We have a deficit now. Do we need storage now? Even at midnight, at the lowest period of time, there's a place in Beirut, in Lebanon, that doesn't have power.
We don't know what's missing in Lebanon. If you look at the demand of energy, the suppressed demand, we have not yet estimated properly. There is a suppressed demand. If you look at the economic growth of 2%, you should expect the demand of energy around 2% at least. And you have a suppressed demand in Lebanon for the last 5-10 years. People have been living bizarrely. So I don't know to what extent we know the demand enough, but I think you will need a minimum storage for your system as well, especially if you go with leapfrogging at the scale that we're talking about. So I think decent ratio will be good. But I think even right now on the storage, if you look at the discussion of the storage in Lebanon, it's also a bit bizarre, because there are a couple of companies that they have been approaching, and that's the end of the story. And they think Tesla will be the first one to run here to build whatever it is factory. So I think we need to build the discussion of if you are really leapfrogging on renewable energy, we go on the hydropower. Let me come back quickly on it. The only large dam that's being constructed right now is the Busri Dam. No, the large. It's a large one. Busri is the largest one, no?
It's already big. It's already big.
No. It's the environmental. The Busri Dam is the one that's being financed by the World Bank. It's a very large that will bring potable water to Beirut. It will have for agriculture and will have some. This is the large. We'll talk about that. The other dam that we have in Lebanon, the other 40, are medium size, small size. So I don't think you can build your energy strategy on hydropower like Norway has done. It's a bit too late now. Well, now that the solar is cheaper, by the way, and with the environmental issue. So I think at this stage, what's very interesting is to move toward an energy mix that can bring a little bit of everything at the same time, but in the short term, what can get you flow?
Okay, I'll take a couple more questions before I come back to Nadim. He has a comment. We'll have a Sir up there. Do you have a microphone? No? I'll come back to you.
Thank you very much. I'm Munir Rashid from the Lebanese Economic Association. I have just a few remarks regarding renewable energy, especially solar and wind, being non-dispatchable, and it's not foreseeable to make them dispatchable. The cost is so high, and it's not foreseeable in the near future, within 10 years or even 20 years. So renewables have very limited use, okay? And when we build them, we still have to have conventional power generation, so the average cost of a system will go up. And I have few other remarks on immediate solutions. When we talk about barges, we are looking at it as a solution versus the small generators that we have. And certainly it's a better solution than the current situation. We cannot go immediately to renewables. And in terms of other short-term solutions, short-term solutions are costly, but when you compare them to the alternative, they become more effective and cheaper. Like today, the short-term solution of barges may be 1 or 2 cents higher than regular generator, but it's much cheaper than what we have. The cost to Lebanon today is approximately $2.2 billion of additional costs for what we are having today between the subsidy and households' cost. So there are alternative solutions immediate that we are not making use of them. Why? It's another story. So also on the gas reserves or use of gas as a source of power, we don't really have a source. We have to have a source for natural gas, which is most efficient in terms of cost and energy production. We can use LNG, but LNG also is expensive. For our future output of gas, it has to be commercially feasible. And even if we discover enough for Lebanon, it's not commercially feasible. I think these wells will be tapped and closed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Here, first row, please. There's a question. Okay.
Gilles Amin from UNDP, and thank you very much for the very diversified panel opinions. I have a comment and then a question to Dr. Saghir. The first comment is, I think there's another elephant in the room, which is the losses in the grid. And I'm going to reference the Ministry of Energy's numbers and the Lebanese presidency. We have 13% technical losses in the grid. So every 1,000 gigawatt hours that we produce, only 870 of it reaches customers. Then we have on top of it an 18%. They call it non-technical loss, I call it theft. Okay? So from the 1,000, we only bill 700 gigawatts. To me, this is a barrel with a lot of holes in it, and we're trying to fill up water in it by using a fork. So, on the other hand, and let's be honest, the only reason the renewable energy projects that Dr. Hassan mentioned, the wind farms and the solar farms, are still advancing is because they haven't shown up on the political map yet. They're not big enough for political bickering to get into them. And I believe when that happens, we're going to end up just like what we have with the IPP, 4 or 5 years behind schedule. Same thing what happened with the Deir Ammar plant, which is still not built. So, if we add on top of that for the transmission to absorb all this capacity, and this is where my question starts. For a country that's 80, 90, $100 billion in debt, should we stop every dollar getting invested right now in generation and in renewable energy and in storage and invest it in plugging the holes in the barrel so that every dollar we spend is not discounted by 30 and 40%? That's one. Two, obviously we can work in parallel, but there should be a policy, or the regularity authority should be there to stop all the discontinuity between all the power sector initiatives to plug these holes so that every dollar we spend, given that we're so much in debt, is effective. From your international experience, let's say you're in a position where you can set the policy for the country. What would you do, and what did other countries do that were in our positions? Thank you.
Last, Vahakan, and then we have two other questions. But Vahakan, then we'll have some answers before we take last, or maybe we should take, so we'll take all questions, I think we're running.
Thank you. Vahakan Kabakian, Climate Change, UNDP Minister of Environment. I have a couple of information about the things that were said, specifically Sovereign Wealth Fund, for example. Has anyone seen the draft law of the Sovereign Wealth Fund? From the panelists? Because there was a point made that Sovereign Wealth Fund does not earmark specific money for climate change or Paris Agreement targets. But the draft law does have that. It might not pass as is, at least in the draft law of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, there are earmarked money specifically for development, but also specifically in investing in renewable energy. On the comment of IFC, Lebanon not benefiting from the IFC, there has been the private sector who has very recently issued with IFC green bonds. So there's that work being done. We had worked with IFC and the Minister of Finance in submitting a proposal, global proposal, to GCF on green bonds, which has not gone through. That's why they moved with the private sector directly in Lebanon. There's a lot of work being done for GCF. However, with what Jill was mentioning, with the 100 billion debt that we have in mitigation, GCF is concessional loans and not grants. So the question is, do we need to bring in more loans, or we might be able to do that by involving the private sector alone in terms of IPPs. Those are the quick general reflections that I want to make. However, and it has been touched in different elements from different people. Dr. Ali mentioned the issue of the grid. Jill brought back that issue. Dr. Hassan mentioned the PPAs. If we don't have a proper grid, you mentioned the 20% integration possibly, and not beyond. If we do not fix the grid, it won't make a difference how many megawatt we are installing in terms of renewable. It is the megawatt hour that is being used or delivered that counts. Going back to Hassan's point, can you imagine the Bedewi situation, but now on renewables? In the sense that I'm a developer, the PPA says the government should pay me whatever I'm generating, irrespective if they are using it on the grid or not. That's what the PPA is. That's how the contract is with renewables. Imagine we get to a point where the wind farms, we have 5, we have 1,000 megawatt of solar power centralized, but the government is not being able, the EDL is not being actually to uptake those and distribute. Contractually, the government needs to pay. There's a bill that reaches, and they have to pay the developer, but not being able to use that electricity. So I think it is extremely important to have a grid in place. And I think there has been a grid code developed, if I'm not wrong, but I'm not sure how far that went in terms of implementation, and also a case study on having a renewable on a municipal level in south of Lebanon. So those initiatives are here and there as case studies, but definitely there's a big problem in having a disintegrated I would be cautious in saying policy, but I will say it, this integrated policy between the renewable energy sector and the thermal energy sector. These need to come together as an integrated it's the same entity, you know what I mean? It has to come together. Otherwise, we will keep on saying thermal, we need thermal. We will always have the need for, at least on the good short and medium term. But I'm also wondering, why aren't we talking about the 2030 targets of renewable energy, and we're still sticking on the 2020 targets? Lebanon has set 15 to 20% renewable for 2030. However, with the use or the transition to natural gas, emission reductions in terms of national commitments are between 15 to 30% emission reduction, greenhouse gas emissions. And most of that reduction comes from natural gas. So that has been taken into account, and we do know that without natural gas, we will not be able to meet our climate-related emission targets. Thank you.
I'll take the last two questions and then go back to the discussants, but please very briefly, because we want to leave some time for the answers.
Hello, I am Majd Alleh. I'm a consultant at the Lebanese Petroleum Administration. Thank you for the discussion. It's very interesting, and I'm happy that at the end we're reaching something very sensible and some realistic conclusions. I think that 100% renewable is a no-brainer today. Maybe in 20 years, 30 years, this can happen, especially if we're talking about centralized solutions. I would like to follow up on what Bahakin has just mentioned. I think that the government today, the Ministry of Energy and Water, is moving in a gradual manner. We have plans for renewables, we have plans for oil and gas. On the oil and gas front, we have the long-term plan, which is getting our own gas, hopefully. On the short term, the plan is to import natural gas. And this will fill the gap between the two. And will, as Dr. Asim was mentioning, fill in the gap in terms of infrastructure. This does not mean that we don't need renewables and we should not be working for that. We should definitely be working for that. But in order to complete the renewable picture, we should have the proper grid, as Dr. Hassan mentioned, We should also work on understanding better the demand side and whether we need storage or not. And we should not oversimplify the renewable story. It can be 3, 4, 5 cent cost of production, but if we add the cost of grid, the cost of storage, and all the other elements, it's not that low. And if we talk about benchmarks, we can talk about Norway and Sweden, but also we can talk about Germany, who's doing the Energiewende and moving away from the nuclear power to renewables. While Germany, the big industrialized country, still relies 30% on coal production, not even natural gas. So let's be realistic. And if we reach Germany first, it's good before reaching Norway. Thank you.
Okay. Last question. You had a question, someone? Yeah?
Tariq Sinjab, LAU Mechanical Engineering. My question is mostly for the UNDP. And I recently read an article that you did a study about geothermal energy, something that wasn't addressed in this talk. And I saw that it wasn't that feasible to perform geothermal power plants. It took around 41 cents per kilowatt. But my question is, did you look into geothermal domestic heating and cooling as a method to decrease the demand of electricity? Thank you.
Okay. So let's start answering. If you can also give your closing comment on where do you see actually Lebanon in the future, the energy scene.
I'll be very quick. Some great comments were mentioned. Regarding, I think, the grid, there's nothing much technically I can add, but I would like to say something about the attitude, especially from policymakers and people who are involved in the planning of the energy sector in Lebanon. Whenever you mention high penetration of renewable, the first thing or the first argument they throw at you is the grid. This is the wrong attitude, because this is not, the grid is not a mystery. It's not something that needs a lot of work or investments. I mean, it does need investments, but not in the billions. And this is something a lot of countries went through, either upgrading the grid, and now they are talking about the grid 2.0. So this is something that is being done, and other countries have done before. So this attitude of, no, we cannot go there because the grid, I know the grid is a problem, but what can you do about it? Or show me your plan. Regarding the dispatchability, and I think just for those in the audience who don't know what dispatchability means, dispatchability essentially means is to supply or to reply to the demand whenever it is needed. So when you have a demand for electricity, you have a source of energy that can be dispatched to meet that demand. And Dr. Rashid is right. 10 years ago, when storage was not well advanced, that yes, maybe wind and solar, and by the way, there's a technology in solar that is dispatchable long time ago, which is solar thermal. So solar thermal is dispatchable because it comes with 8 to 10 hours storage. And so renewables right now, with the advancement and the cost reduction of storage, are dispatchable. Regarding also the barges comment, I think this is something that has taken or occupied a lot of debate in Lebanon recently. My comment is economic. So the cost, according to the government, of barges is around $700 million per year. They say that we want barges for 3 years. I doubt it. I think if they are going for barges, they would need it for much more. But for the argument's sake, let's say that they will take the barges for 3 years. So we're talking about $2.1 billion. With $2.1 billion capital spent over 3 years, you can build state-of-the-art solar power plant with storage, because it doesn't make sense to build a large solar power plant without storage, by the way. It's uneconomic. So, and not for 3 years, for 30 years. Let this number sink in. Yep. And also, regarding your question, I think the debate about energy, honestly, goes beyond technicalities. I am a technical guy, but it goes deep into the political economy of this country. And people talk about non-technical losses. People have to ask why we have these theft or non-technical losses. The whole political economy of this country has to be fixed. There are marginalized groups in this country have to be cared for before we ask them to stop taking electricity and not paying for it. So moving forward, I think we need to assess our love-hate relationship with the political establishment. We hate them when we don't have renewable. We hate them when we stuck in traffic. We hate them when there is no electricity. But when it comes to election, we love them.
Yeah, thank you for a great panel and for great comments and questions as well. Just a quick closing remark. I think whichever way Lebanon goes in terms of the electricity or the energy mix there, one is dependent on a certain level of support or a certain level of acceptance in the population. So it's difficult to do something that very many people opposes. To a certain extent, I mean, it depends a bit on which people opposes it. And of course, sometimes you have to do something that people oppose. I mean, if people do not want to conserve energy, maybe they have to do so either way. So it's a trade-off, but it certainly makes sense to pay attention to matters of inclusion, to providing benefits for local communities, and so on when projects are developed. And also, I think there's a lot to be gained from considering how this will be affected in the future. As I mentioned earlier, that the decisions taken today will have a lot to say for acceptability for different solutions in the future, and that you can start on a path that will have a lot of effects in the future. And I think even though energy consumption or electricity consumption in Lebanon today is very low, it should go up. People should have a steady supply of electricity and so on. But on the other hand, my impression is that people are quite used to being conscious about how and when you spend electricity, which is a resource that can be employed in the future, both in terms of conservation, but also in terms of how you use electricity, as we talked about storage and so on. And then finally, I think there might be a lot we have talked a bit about the different studies that have been made in Lebanon today, which are tremendous. And there's a great study made by CEDRO as well in terms of willingness to pay, whether or not people are willing to pay for renewables. But I think there is a lot to be gained as well from gaining more knowledge about why or why not people support different initiatives and what kind of features that are important for whether or not people support initiatives that also might go beyond service perhaps from a more qualitative approach. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, John.
Okay. I just want to answer Tariq from LEU. First of all, thank you so much for your question. Indeed, as part of the scanning of all the resources, natural resources in Lebanon to generate power, geothermal, deep geothermal was one of them. And with deep geothermal, the closer the heat is to the surface, the more economical it is. And and this was just a study, we didn't have money to dig the 1,000+ meter borehole and to see the gradient of temperature. But we used shallow, abandoned boreholes, we used rock samples, to the lab and what have you. So we did a quick assessment on this issue. It's not that it's not feasible. We recommended that there is something in Akkad, you can see lava stones, I think, which is an indication of a heat source that this used to be closer to the surface. And the gradient, if you see in that report, is mostly in the Akkad area as well. So we recommended strongly a demonstration project in that area, 1, 2, 3 megawatts, whatever it is, which will better enable us to see the feasibility of this technology because it is a dispatchable technology. It's there all the time, just like a conventional power source, and that's what's interesting about it. In terms of ground source heat pump, we have 2 demonstration projects. One was done like 5 years ago at a municipality in somewhere in Jbeil. Unfortunately, the municipality was supposed to be a small, cute, nice municipality. But then overnight they transformed it. They wanted to do a Majlis Baladi, Asr Baladi, so a huge building, and they ran out of money. So, and this made very bad publicity. Even the Minister of Energy once told me, but this technology does not work. They tried it in this municipality in Jbeil. I was like, no, they did not try it. It's installed there, but we're waiting to turn it on for years now, hoping that they'll finish this big castle. We have another project, ground source heat pump, over 1 megawatt of potential for a hospital that's going to be run by UBMC in the south. This is 1 megawatt. It has 180 boreholes, each one 102 meter deep, connected to the heat pumps. It's a 4-pipe system. That means when we take heat from the building in summer, we don't store it in the ground immediately. We heat water with it, then we store it in the ground. And in the winter, we use the heat of the ground to heat the building and generate hot water. This is hopefully going to be operational the same time next year, so we are looking into that.
Do you have any closing comments?
No, thank you very much. One final comment that's in the back of my mind is that there is a difference between weak sustainability and strong sustainability. And I think that with time, the issue of climate change is not a joke. It used to increase around 2 parts per million every year, more or less on average. Now it's increasing 2.5, 3 parts per million every year. We cannot continue to think that, oh yes, for 25 years BP says oil and gas is going to be oil and gas, unless they do something about carbon capture and storage. So I do believe that the seriousness of climate change is going to dictate more and more the urgency of our responses and how we react in our responses. Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan. Nadim?
Thank you. Several points, but I'll incorporate them with my responses to some of the issues raised. Looking forward, I strongly and I wholeheartedly believe that an integrated development approach is required for the entire country. We cannot develop one sector without looking at other issues. From LAU, you talked about geothermal issues. That's one part in developing a building code for Lebanon where we go green. And going green is not just about energy, it's about water, it's about disposing of our waste, it's about how we can incorporate our waste. Nobody talked about converting waste to energy. I'm not talking burning the waste. it is digesting that waste and getting energy out of it. Getting energy out of wastewater is another issue that is great. We get rid of two problems at the same time. We need to integrate our transportation plans so that we use less fossil fuel and more clean energy. Our water sector demands that we have access to good energy so that we have access to water and treat that water as well once we use it. We need to store our food and distribute it, and that relies totally on energy. So within that, we need to look at how well we can generate electricity and keep it clean, as well as using it for other purposes than electricity. Jamal talked about, and somebody else talked about, decentralizing and looking at municipality lands, and there are lands. This scared the dickens out of me. We don't have land. Lebanon is tiny. We do not have enough land to put in photovoltaics everywhere. Hassan mentioned earlier that we do have enough space to put photovoltaics away from natural reserves. Fine, but we cannot rely just on natural reserves to maintain those. We need to maintain the green cover that we have, to maintain the biodiversity that we have, to ward off and to reduce our vulnerability to many aspects and to increase our resilience. This then, I will talk about the regional grid a little bit. But then we need to look, when we look at renewables and other forms of energy, we need to look at the life cycle of these, not just the emissions as we operate them, it's how we produce these forms, not produce, everything from the manufacturing to the disposal of all these needs to be taken into consideration, and look at the various environmental consequences in addition to the emissions. And then I totally agree with Hassan about time. In a way, it's on our side, because it will create the new generation coming up. Richard is raising most of those kids now at IC and similar schools. These people, you have to sit with these kids. They're phenomenal. They really buy into the idea of sound, green, environment-friendly approaches. These people are going to be your pressure groups in the future, and they will demand better issues. So they will get our behavioral change into better, cleaner environments. The regional grid is something that we all dreamt about. Maybe if we can hook up and let others produce the electricity and we hook up to it, that in utopia, but that is eventually something that we can get into. But until that comes along, we really need to look inward and think inwardly. One last point. 2 days ago, I think, California has required all new construction to have solar panels on site. And that is mandatory. We should start getting into requiring any new construction, not even small homes, big homes, to acquire greener building in that sense. So shut up, yes, thank you, but thank you all.
That's a good one. On the question of the transmission and also on the question of the international community. Listen, the 40% technical and administrative, they call it administrative losses. These are illegal connections, basically. Okay, let's start with that. I can live with 10% technical losses. I have no problem with that. Your question basically go back to utility reform. EDL is an old-fashioned lady that needs to reform. We need to do something with utility. And they have, I talked to the CEO, I talked to a lot of people, they have difficulties to reform themselves. So I think the utility side of the energy strategy is another issue, but that's part of the utility discussions in water sector and other sectors. That's utility reform. So I think let's go back to the issue of energy. Your question about how people perceive us. And if you look for the last 20 years, how many promises have been made on energy reform, people have doubt that you will deliver. The last conference, the CEDAR conference, made it very clear. Energy sector is core part of it, and there are clear action needs to be done if you want to see money on the table. That's very clear. I don't think any donors will fund anything if you don't show them goodies. I don't think a single donor will finance you a dirty oil project. I know that the World Bank will not finance any gas coal project, any coal project, that I know it, I put the rules. They will not do it. They will finance right now, IFC is working on the IPPs for the two projects. Probably the gas conversion will be one of the main conditions. If they put HFO, there will be no funding from at least the World Bank or IFC because they will not be allowed. So I think that now the international community will be putting some pressure by saying these are the minimum requirements if you want to play a game. This is your country's sovereignty, do whatever you want. And I think that's the chance right now to do something different because people are cornered. Now come the vested interest, another way of saying corruption. The vested interests are very interesting actually when you look at it in terms of political economy. The energy sector is only a reflection of the rest of the country, so it's not isolated from this question. We have to be clear about it. You cannot resolve the corruption issue by looking at the energy sector. And you have to look at it broadly, and that's where political will to cut on corruption is needed. And you do hope, you remember that we had the minister responsible of anti-corruption, you remember? I don't remember his name.
We still do have.
We still have. Yeah, it's interesting, huh? I would love to see him accountable to what he delivered. If you want to talk about governance, let's talk about it. This is his job. He has to to look at the cost of power. Okay, look at the cost of the wind project. 10 cents per kilowatt. 10 cents. The wind.
For 10 cents?
Yes, that's what the government is going to pay.
I can produce it in my home for 2 cents.
I know that. The government want to buy it. The government want to buy it for 10 cents. They insist to buy it for 10 cents. You know that.
But why?
Why? There is a difference between the 4 cents and the 10 cents.
That's the difference. Why is that difference?
But figure it out. That's the beautiful of the system.
I'm asking you why. Because we did a study. I don't want to.
I'm not going to start getting
Yeah,
into politics.
exactly.
It's not my job.
We can continue this discussion.
There's a study about de-risking renewable energy investments in Lebanon, and it went out and asked investors, equity, how much they want to return, and banks, how much they will lend money. And they found out that it's so much different. It's 16% return on equity, and it's 9% for banks. They want a return on such investments. Why? Because there's no proper regulatory authority. Why? Because they're so uncertain about the grid, and the grid, if it's able to take these power. And why? There's political risks and what have you. So yes, the bidding game was not done properly. It should have been lower, but these are the risks that should be taken into account. So that's why, not because there's corruption per se.
No. Sorry, let's disagree. 4 cents, you add 2 cents on the country risk, I fully agree with you. 2 cents. Oh, that's what I would see in terms of LIBOR plus 1, 2, I would say 2 cents. You can regulate by contract. You don't always need a regulator. Let's be clear about it. If you have a good contract, you can regulate by contract. The problem, you don't have good contract. So that I will not add it as part of my 1 cent, maybe half a cent. If you look at then the cost of funding, cost of financing, cost of funding on Lebanon compared to African or Asian, it's not that bad. There is money available, for God's sake. EBRD is begging you to give them project. Talk to EBRD. The World Bank is sitting on $300 million. They don't know what to do with it. That's why they promise the same thing every time there is a donors conference. Money is available. IFC does not have a serious lending project except in the banking and the insurance. That's why they are funding some of the solar and the so cost of money and money, I don't see it as that. The political risk, you can get a guarantee for that. MEGA can give you a guarantee. The problem, packaging and make the case convincing to the international community, to the market. They are not able to make it. Bloomberg Energy is not able to look at Lebanon. Why? They look around you, look everywhere. They don't look at Lebanon seriously because there is no political will to do basic reform, put the basic, lay down the ground to do a serious sound energy sector. And I think that's why you are going transaction by transaction, and we are going still with same mood of emergency since the civil war ended. And there is not yet laying down. That come back to what my colleague is saying. You don't have an integrated pieces together. Are they interested to discuss in the Council of Ministers energy strategy? I've seen what they've discussed in March. It's pieces. It's pieces. You look at what's missing always is the umbrella. What will be the impact on growth? Can somebody tell me this? If you have good energy strategy, if you have good energy impetus, what matters for me is growth. Growth, that means job creation. That means getting out of poverty. This discussion never happened in Lebanon. Energy growth, never discussion. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. It was really a very great discussion, very constructive, and can all have more private discussions with our speakers during the coffee break.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.